Okay, so I'm going to go over the test with you, or the test review with you guys. I think the first question is the one everyone struggled with the most, and this is a type of diagram that they show on the STAR test. So you do need to understand how to break this apart. So when you're looking at this, first of all, it says all three aquatic plants are competing for the most over abiotic resources. So, I honestly feel like that may be worded a little wrong. What we're looking for here is maybe not competing over resources necessarily, but maybe they're competing because they all in a similar environment. If you all are in the same part of the ecosystem, you're going to end up competing more, especially if you're plants, because plants are usually competing over the same resources. So when we take a look at this, we have to break it apart. First of all, underneath here, it's showing you a range. We have a range of warmer to colder, a range of water with many particles to clearer water, which means maybe there's not so many particles. There may be almost no particles floating around in the water. Here we have slower water, and over here we have faster water. So again, it's a range. So you have to find, where do my species all show up? What type of environment are they all going to be found in? Well, you have to look at the bars here of species 1, species 2, and species 3. Over here, it's not going to work for me because species 1 and species 2 don't reach this far. Over here, species 3 isn't over here. So I know that where they are competing the most is going to be here in the middle where the bars overlap. So how would you describe that environment? Well, it's in between warm and cold. So you might say you've got mild temperatures here. Okay. You've got, on this end, you've got water with many suspended particles. Here, there's pretty much like no particles in the water. So there in the middle, I might say there's just water with some particles. So some particles floating in the water. That is terrible. Oh, sorry. Let's fix that. Some particles. In the water. Okay. And then finally, it's not slow water, it's not fast water, so we might say our water flows at medium speed. Okay, overall, anytime you're looking at something like this, you're always looking for what the organism, whoever is competing, what does that organism have in common with the other organisms in that environment? Do they have the same food resources? Do they need the same type of environment? Like these plants all need a very similar environment over there in the middle because that's where they overlap. So always look for what do they have in common. That is most likely what they are competing for. Okay, the next one. Describe 2 organelles plant cells have that animal cells do not have, and include the function of each. The 2 big differences are the cell wall, which provides structure. Okay, and then the chloroplasts, and they take in light for photosynthesis. Okay, so now for the food web here, we need to label our producers and our consumers. Remember, a producer is something that produces its own food using energy from the sun. Typically, we are talking about plants because they use photosynthesis as a process to produce glucose. So we have three producers here. We have carrots, we have grasses, we have grains. So you know that everything else must be a consumer because one, the easiest way in a food web to see is that the arrow is showing the flow of energy coming to them from another organism. So we know they are consuming another organism for energy. They depend on another organism for energy. So everything else here is a consumer. Okay. Then it says which organisms will compete for the same food source in this food web. Okay. Well, the easiest way to look at this is the food source always has arrows leaving it and pointing to the consumer. So, for example, here my grasses have arrows leaving it and pointing to the rabbits and pointing to the grasshoppers. That's saying that the grasshoppers are getting their energy from the grasses when they consume it. So if it's got two arrows leaving it, then it probably has, or then it definitely has more than one thing consuming it. So my rabbit and my grasshoppers are competition. They are competing for grasses. So that's one example. Rabbits and grasshoppers. Okay. And then we have another, I think we have two more examples here. We have grains. They are consumed by the birds, the grasshoppers, and the mice. So those three organisms are competitors. Okay. And then our last set of consumers that are competing will be for the grasshopper because the bird and the owl are both consuming the grasshopper. All right. On the last part, it says, would the organisms in this environment be able to survive if all the grasses died off? Why or why not? So our grasses have died. Will the rest of the organisms be able to survive? Well, yes, absolutely. We've lost one food source. So there may be more competition between some of our consumers. For example, since the grasshopper lost a food source, he will be consuming more grains, causing more competition between the birds and the grasshoppers. However, because he has an alternative food source, he will survive, and so will everyone who is consuming him. Same thing here. The rabbit has lost a food source, but since he still has another one, he will survive, and so will everything above him. So while some may struggle, and there may be a few organisms who die, overall, the organisms in the environment, the populations of organisms will survive. They may decrease, but they will still survive. Remember, when we have a variety of organisms in a population, we are talking about biodiversity. Okay, so when we're explaining this, we need to be talking about biodiversity. So we can say, yes, the organisms will survive. Because the ecosystem has a diverse population of plants. Okay, There we go. Okay, on the next one, we are working through a dichotomous key. So they're wanting us to find bird W. And let me say, the biggest issue that my students here in class have had is they're forgetting that when you're looking at a dichotomous key, you are comparing the birds relative to each other. So what that means is when you're looking at the characteristics, you want to compare them to everybody else in this group. For example, we have two choices here. We have the beak is relatively long and slender. Ooh, what is that doing? Okay, let's try this again. It's either relatively long and slender or it's stout and heavy. So remember, long and slender is like skinny, okay? Stout and heavy, think big and broad like a football player. So here, I would say slender belongs to bird Y. So bird W in this case, I would say is definitely stout and heavy. So it says we need to go to 2. So we're going to 2. Now we have to look at, is the lower beak relatively flat and straight, or is the lower beak curved? So when you look at this, we're comparing this side of the beak to everyone else here. And I would say that this guy, compared to the others, definitely has a straight lower beak. So that tells me this is my answer. Okay. So remember, with the dichotomous key, you always just want to make sure you're comparing it to everything else in the example and that you're following the steps. Okay. Reproduction produces what type of reproduction produces offspring genetically identical to the parent organism? Remember that is asexual reproduction. Since we only have one parent, it is passing all of its genetics to the offspring. So they are identical. They have the same exact genetic makeup. For the second one, it would be sexual reproduction. Produces genetically diverse. Remember, diverse means a variety or a bunch of different types or different genetics in this case. So, for example, in our fish stick lab, when we had our fish mate, if we had 2 orange fish mate, well, because there are 2 different parents and they could have different combinations of genes, you might have ended up with a red fish as your offspring or a yellow fish with your offspring. That's diverse offspring because you're getting one allele for each characteristic going there. So you have a genetically diverse offspring when you have 2 parents. Okay, which part of the cell contains the chromosomes? Remember, chromosomes are part of that DNA. Remember that each part of the chromosome is a gene. That's what we were working with with our alleles. So when we're thinking about chromosomes, always think DNA, and that is located in the nucleus. Next, it says what characteristics qualify an organism to be classified in Kingdom Plantae. Now, there are many different characteristics that this kingdom has, but what makes it stand apart from the other kingdoms? Definitely because they are autotrophic. Remember, an autotroph, auto meaning that it makes its own food, right? We're thinking photosynthesis, taking in the sun's energy and producing glucose. Okay, so they are definitely autotrophic. They also look at features of the cell. So again, we're looking at the cell part. So they have a cell wall. They have chloroplasts. They are eukaryotic cells, meaning Remember, eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus. So
teachers and students, pardon the interruption. This is the last call to have your picture taken. The photographer is going to leave in 5 minutes. Teachers and students, if you have not had your picture taken, please go to the gym. Regardless if you're buying them, we need your picture for the yearbook, so please make your way to the gym to have your picture taken. Thank you.
sorry about that, but I'm not starting the video over, so we're just going to keep going on. So there are other characteristics for Kingdom Plantae, but I'm out of room. And these are really the characteristics that are going to help you truly identify, hey, this is different than my other kingdoms. So next we have what characteristics qualify an organism to be classified in the kingdom Protista. Remember with a protists, we're talking about like our junk drawer kingdom. If they cannot be classified in other kingdoms, they're going to fall in as a protist. So first of